and thank you for being here. So my presentation is on the role of public discourse and freedom of speech and shaping the success and failures of the American Revolution. And I start my presentation with a little quote from one of the revolutionary leaders in France, Georges Danton. Messieurs, j'ai près avant pu vous faire sortir d'ici, mais moi, voilà, m'amime avec vous, et je ne sais comment cela finira, which translates to, gentlemen, I hoped before long to free you from here, but here I am with you, and I do not know how this will end, which is a quote attributed to Georges Danton on April 4th of 1794, shortly after he was arrested by fellow revolutionary leaders for essentially attempting to bring the revolution back towards a middle ground, and he was promptly executed the following day. In this presentation, I seek to examine the causation of both the American and French revolutions, and subsequently the role and importance of public discourse and freedom of speech in shaping the success of the American Revolution and the failures of the French. To convey the importance in both revolutions, I will use paintings, political cartoons, personal writings, and laws that were stamped into history and the major unfolding events. And I've also added a note focusing on the role of women and their importance in the subject. So I'll start with the American Revolution backgrounds and beliefs. And I've highlighted several key points in the American Revolution history prior to the war itself, starting with the French and Indian War, which, while the American and British side won this war in particular, the resulting debt that occurred for the British forces in fighting the French and the Indians would end up laying the groundwork for a bunch of the ideas of revolution. For example, shortly following the war, many colonists had decided to try and move and bought large amounts of land in the newly acquired territories. However, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 following the war stole the ability of the colonists to maintain those lands. So even though they paid for lands in Ohio and other neighboring territories, the lands were taken away, but they were not given their money back. Instead, the land went to the crown. This tension would then rise, especially following the Stamp Act in 1764, and then seeing most notably the Boston Tea Parties as a sign of rebellion in 1773, to which the Intolerable Acts were passed, which were 4 major acts, including the Boston Port Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, the Administration of Justice, and the Quartering Act, which essentially took away nearly all civil liberties, especially in Boston and the state of Massachusetts, as punishment for their rebellion with the tea. And then most notably was the Government Act, which withdrew the Massachusetts Charter and gave control to the Crown for the state of Massachusetts. And then obviously the Declaration of Independence in 1776 sent a very strong message towards the British and kicked off the fundamental war of revolution. And then I want to start with just a depiction of the Boston Massacre and some of the things to highlight. This was a depiction in the local metropolitan newspaper and actually was depicted by Paul Revere. So some key points. On point A, you see the British troops are firing into the crowd of colonists. At point B, where the British troops are obviously armed well, they have no signs of stopping firing, despite the fact that at point C, you see already people have fallen due to wounds and are dying, and there appears to be no means of defense for the people at point B. And very important, in the back, you see the church looking over everything that's happening as a call to what is good and what is not good for what is happening. And then a couple notes on the major role of women going into the revolution and beyond. On the left is a letter from Abigail Adams supporting her husband following the Declaration and the beginning of the onset of war, where she writes that the inequality of property gives an aristocratic turn to all their proceedings and occasions, a strong aversion in their partisans to common sense, but the spirit of these barons is coming down and it must submit, which is really strong language and something that should be highlighted, the amount of support that she gave her husband and one of the first presidents of our country. On the right is a picture of Molly Pitcher firing a cannon at the Battle of Monmouth, which Molly Pitcher is actually kind of a folklore hero. The real woman, Molly Hayes, was then also added as a caricature of other women who would be found in different battles and having handwritten notes from other soldiers participating in these battles about women who had stepped up when soldiers had fallen and they had gone from tending wounds to actually helping participate in the fight going on. And then shifting gears a little bit to the French side. So some major causations of the French Revolution were the national debt, the system of taxation in place, historic class inequality, and failed influence based on weakened French influence and power. So by 1780, even though 20% of the existing citizens of France were in the nobility, clergy, and aristocracy, they controlled 93% of the wealth of the nation. And inside of that, the clergy did not have to pay taxes on anything that they owned or operated. This class inequality was especially maintained through the lack of education and opportunity of lower classes, wherein 79% of the members of the third estate or the common class had no ability to educate themselves or pursue any forms of education, and as a result were illiterate through the reigns of Louis XIV through his great-grandson Louis XVI. And then finally, the major reform attempts, especially by Finance Minister Calonne in the 1780s, were to reset the method of taxation, revive free trade, and authorize the sale of church property. And in attempting to do so, he formed a league of French notables who, at the meetings, turned on him and tried to use him as a scapegoat and raise their own public stature as a means of trying to maintain the status quo, which obviously is not going to work for them very well. So here's a famous political cartoon from France that has been around for a very long time. Person A is actually King Louis himself. B is representative of the clergy. C is representative of the nobility and the aristocracy. And you see these three all look, they're plump, they're very gaudy dressed, and everything for the most part seems to be very fine. And then in part D, you see the common man being suppressed by the weight. And then the women in the early stages of the French Revolution is equally important because they were the first, they were able to help break down the immortal visage of the French nobility, as they were the ones who marched on Versailles for the bread riots and actually brought the royal family away from Versailles and back to Paris to try and actually do something about the struggling citizens. And then here are Claire Lacombe and Pauline Léon, primary founders of the Society of Revolutionary Republican Women, who fought for the rights of women early in the revolution. And although they would eventually be outlawed by the new government to take full power, they were able to fight for price controls for families, and as well as gain the right for women to divorce their husbands until that ability was repealed in 1804. So the turning point between both revolutions were that the American Revolution found success in public discourse, as the founding fathers were able to use discourse and freedom of speech to connect with the people and establish the new way forward, whereas leaders of the French Revolution essentially eliminated freedom of speech and public discourse and caused their own eventual downfall. The major efforts of the founding fathers can be seen in numerous Federalist Papers, where James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay attempts to connect with the people and establish why a new constitution was needed following the failures of the Articles of Confederation and first form of government in our country, including the need for taxation, the ability to run a federal army, as well as presenting fears about political factions. In response, many anti-federalists came forward who thought that the new constitution actually gave too much power to this new budding federal government and would take away the civil liberties of the past. But what was key here was that the two sides were able to publicly sway each other and ultimately pass a constitution and the Bill of Rights where the people were involved with the process from the beginning. And then conversely, on the French side of things, the evolving power and rise of more radical ideas, particularly from Jean-Paul Marat and Maximilien Robespierre, led to the downfall of the French Revolution, which can be particularly seen in the law of Vendée-Perrier and the subsequent rise of the Terror, where this law essentially eliminated the freedom of speech in France, as well as the ability for a fair and just trial. So now if the Committee on Public Safety viewed you as a threat to democracy and to France, they could throw you in jail and execute you within 24 hours. You lost your ability to have a free trial. Another famous image from this moment comes where you see the destruction of a printing press, the silencing of women at point B, the destruction of the press is highlighted at point A, and point C is a Robespierre dressed as a new general and king and very proud of his ability to destroy the public. And ultimately, this would result in not only the fall of the French Revolution and the ideas that they had started and morally fought for, but the assassination of Jean-Paul Marat, as well as the attempted suicide and then the death of Robespierre at the guillotine. And these would lay eventually to a little fun part of Napoleon's rise to power and his coronation, and to show that fake news has been around for a long time. At point A is actually Napoleon's mother. This is a painting of Napoleon's coronation, and at this point, he's preparing to bestow the crown on his wife, Josephine. Napoleon's mother at point A actually refused to attend the service because of Josephine's ideas on slavery and her desire to reinstitute the practice in France. And then at point B, interestingly, Napoleon pushed to have Jesus depicted at his coronation, and even though you see Jesus is here, the clergy next to him are all still focused on Napoleon, despite that Jesus has risen again in this painting. So ultimately, these events occurred over 200 years ago. However, the impact and role of public discourse and freedom of speech not only shaped what success the American Revolution had and the failures of the French, but we continue to see in the modern world how important freedom of speech is in not only our country and other developed countries, but those countries developing around the world with different forms of government. So, thank you. So, any questions? Thanks for your. How do you think your work helps us revise the way people today? I think what's really interesting is you obviously see politicians always talk about, either founding fathers rolling in their graves, or they're upset about how we're doing something this way or that. And I think there's generally a lot of misconceptions regarding the founding fathers and what they were pursuing. In many ways, especially like the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, for instance, the founding fathers were very politically savvy, to the extent that in Federalist 10, which is one of the most cited Federalist papers, Madison warns of the use of political parties and factions and how destructive they can be. Yet 3 years after writing this particular essay, he's actually the head of one of the newest political parties and using it to help further not only his ideas, but the ideas that his party is representing. So I think people do like to have like this very moral high ground of many of the founders, and many of them are very brilliant and obviously had amazing ideas, but there was also many instances of kind of going back on some of the things they said and not always necessarily putting their money where their mouth is, I guess would be the right way of putting it.
Anybody have any other questions for Alex? All right, Alex, thank you very much. It was an excellent talk. I appreciate your contributions.
Thank you for
Yeah,
having me.
very good talk. Thank you.